Hello dear listener, please subscribe to our channel. Enjoy watching. Gideon Hartman had lived his entire life in the small, fog-bound coastal town of Gray Harbor. The town itself was unremarkable to outsiders, a place where the ocean met jagged cliffs, where the fog rolled in like a thick blanket each morning, and where the local fishermen spent their days battling the unpredictable seas. But to those who lived there, Gray Harbor was more than just a speck on the map. It was a place steeped in history, in whispers of old legends, and in secrets that seemed as deep and dark as the ocean itself. Gideon was a man molded by the harsh realities of life by the sea. Tall and broad-shouldered, with the weathered skin and calloused hands of a man who had spent decades pulling nets from the water, he was respected by the townsfolk. He was known for his quiet strength, for his ability to withstand the sea's tempers, and for the unwavering loyalty he showed to his wife, Elise. For 15 years, they had been together, their marriage built on the foundations of trust, mutual respect, and a deep, abiding love, or so Gideon had believed. But lately, something had changed. It was a subtle shift at first, so small that he barely noticed it. Elise had always been the light of his life, a woman with a smile that could brighten even the darkest of days. But now, that light seemed dimmed. She became distant, her once vibrant laughter replaced by a cold, almost detached demeanor. She started spending more time away from home, her reasons vague and unconvincing. At first, Gideon told himself it was nothing. People changed, relationships had their ups and downs. He had seen it all before in the other couples of Gray Harbor, people who had been together so long that the spark inevitably dimmed, only to be reignited later. But as the weeks turned into months, Gideon could no longer ignore the nagging feeling in his gut. Something was wrong. It was on a foggy Tuesday evening, as Gideon returned from a long day at sea, that the first real crack in their marriage appeared. The house was dark when he entered, the only sound the distant crash of waves against the cliffs. He called out for Elise, but there was no answer. The silence that greeted him was unnerving, an unnatural stillness that set his nerves on edge. He moved through the house, the wooden floors creaking beneath his heavy boots, and paused outside their bedroom door. It was slightly ajar, a faint light spilling out into the hallway. The unease that had been simmering in his gut flared into something sharper, more acute. Slowly, he pushed the door open. What he saw froze him in place. Elise was lying in their bed, her golden hair spread across the pillow, and beside her, another figure, a man, younger, with a face that Gideon knew all too well. It was Victor Monroe, the town's new doctor, the man who had been treating the elderly and infirm, the man who had shared drinks with Gideon at the local pub. The man who now lay tangled in the sheets with his wife. For a long moment, Gideon could only stare, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. The air in the room was thick with the scent of sweat and betrayal. Elise looked up, her eyes widening in shock, but before she could speak, Gideon turned and walked out of the room, his steps slow, deliberate. His mind was blank, his body moving on autopilot as he left the house and headed for the cliffs. The wind whipped at his face as he stood at the edge, staring down at the churning waves below. His heart was pounding in his chest, a mix of fury, hurt, and disbelief coursing through his veins. How had he missed the signs? How long had this been going on right under his nose? The cold, biting air helped clear his thoughts, and slowly, a plan began to form in his mind. He wouldn't confront them, not yet. Instead, he would wait. He would watch. And then, when the time was right, he would make them pay for what they had done. Over the next few days, Gideon became a shadow in his own life. He watched Elise and Victor from a distance, his presence unnoticed as they carried on their affair in secret. He learned their routine, the times they met, the places they went. It was easy, too easy, to track their movements. Victor had become complacent, confident that no one would suspect a thing, especially not Gideon. But Gideon saw everything. He saw the way Victor touched her, the way she laughed at his jokes, the way they whispered to each other in the dark corners of Gray Harbor. And with each passing day, the cold resolve in Gideon's heart hardened, his plans for revenge growing more intricate, more calculated. Then, on a Thursday evening, When the fog was thicker than ever, Gideon made his move. Victor had rented a small cabin at the edge of town, just past the old lighthouse that had once guided ships safely to shore but now stood as a crumbling relic of the past. It was there that Victor and Elise met, believing themselves safe from prying eyes. But Gideon knew better. He had followed them there once before, staying hidden in the shadows as they embraced, oblivious to the world around them. This time, Gideon arrived before they did. He let himself into the cabin using the spare key that Victor foolishly kept hidden under a loose stone by the front steps. Inside, the cabin was warm and cozy, a fire crackling in the fireplace. It was a place meant for comfort, for romance, but tonight, it would be the setting for something far darker. Gideon moved through the cabin with purpose, his mind sharp and focused. He disabled the lights first, cutting the power to the cabin so that only the dim light of the fire would illuminate the room. Then, he retrieved a heavy length of rope from the toolbox Victor kept in the closet, coiling it around his hand as he waited. It wasn't long before he heard the sound of tires on gravel, followed by the murmur of voices. Gideon tensed, his heart pounding in his chest as the door creaked open. He could hear their laughter, soft and intimate, as they stepped inside, their silhouettes barely visible in the dim light. "Elise?" Victor's voice was low, puzzled as he noticed the darkness. "The lights are out." "Maybe a fuse blew," Elise suggested, her voice light and unconcerned. Gideon remained silent, watching from the shadows as they fumbled around in the dark. He waited until they were closer to the fire, until they were distracted by each other, before he stepped forward. "Looking for something?" Gideon's voice cut through the darkness like a knife. Victor jumped, his hand flying to Elise's arm as they both turned toward the sound. The look on their faces was priceless, a mix of shock, fear, and disbelief. They hadn't expected this, not here, not now. "Gideon," Elise breathed, her voice trembling. "What are you doing here?" "Funny," Gideon said, his voice cold as he stepped closer, the firelight casting eerie shadows across his face. "I was about to ask you the same thing." Victor tried to step in front of Elise, his expression one of nervous bravado. "Gideon, let's talk about this. There's no need for violence." "Is that what you think?" Gideon asked, his tone mocking. "That we can just talk this out, like civilized men?" He took another step forward, his hand tightening around the rope. The anger that had been simmering inside him for weeks was now a roaring inferno, his need for revenge almost palpable. "Elise, go outside," Victor said, his voice strained as he tried to push her toward the door. "I'll handle this." But Elise didn't move. She was frozen in place, her eyes wide with fear as she stared at Gideon. She had never seen him like this before, this man who was her husband, but also a stranger. There was something dark and dangerous in his eyes, something that terrified her. "No one's going anywhere," Gideon said, his voice low and menacing. "Not until we settle this." Without warning, he lunged at Victor, the rope unfurling in his hands as he wrapped it around the younger man's neck. Victor's eyes bulged in shock as he struggled against Gideon's grip, his hands clawing at the rope as he gasped for breath. Elise screamed, but the sound was lost to the roar of blood in Gideon's ears. He tightened his grip, his muscles straining as he dragged Victor to the ground, pinning him beneath his weight. The two men grappled in the firelight, the room filled with the sound of their labored breathing, the scuffle of feet on the wooden floor. Victor fought hard, his fists striking out blindly as he tried to free himself. But Gideon was stronger, fueled by a rage that had been building for weeks. He could feel the other man's strength waning, the fight slowly leaving him as the rope cut deeper into his throat. Gideon didn't let up. He pulled the rope tighter, his teeth gritted with effort as Victor's struggles grew weaker, more desperate. And then, with a final, choked gasp, Victor went limp, his body collapsing to the floor. The mist swirled around them as they made their way down the narrow path that led to the cliffs. Elise stumbled over the rough terrain, her heart pounding in her chest as she realized where Gideon was taking her. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of the waves crashing below. "Please, Gideon." "Don't do this." But Gideon didn't respond. He continued to pull her along, his mind focused on one thing, what he had to do next. They reached the edge of the cliffs, the jagged rocks jutting out below, and Elise felt a wave of vertigo wash over her as she looked down at the churning sea. "Gideon," she pleaded, her voice shaking. "You don't have to do this. We can leave, start over somewhere else." But Gideon shook his head, his expression grim. "There's no starting over, Elise. Not after this." He released her arm, and for a moment, Elise thought he might spare her. But then he stepped closer, his eyes dark and empty as he looked down at her. "I love you," he said quietly, his voice filled with a sadness that cut through the fog. "I would have done anything for you. But you threw it all away." Elise opened her mouth to speak, to plead with him one last time, but the words caught in her throat as Gideon took another step forward, closing the distance between them. "And now," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper, "I have nothing left to lose." Before Elise could react, Gideon reached out and shoved her, hard. She stumbled backward, her feet slipping on the wet rocks, and then she was falling, the world spinning around her as she plunged toward the sea below. The last thing she heard was the sound of Gideon's voice, echoing in the darkness. "Goodbye, Elise." And then, with a sickening thud, she hit the rocks, the impact shattering her body like glass. The waves swallowed her up, pulling her down into the cold, dark depths of the ocean. Gideon stood at the edge of the cliffs, staring down at the churning water below. The fog was thick around him, the night silent save for the distant roar of the sea. He felt nothing, no guilt, no regret, just a cold, hollow emptiness that filled his chest like a void. He had done what he needed to do. He had taken his revenge, exacted his justice. But the satisfaction he had expected to feel never came. Instead, there was only the numbness, the realization that he was now truly alone. Gideon turned away from the cliffs and began the long walk back to the cabin. The fog swallowed him up as he disappeared into the night, his mind a blank slate. He didn't know what he would do next, where he would go. All he knew was that the life he had once known was over, destroyed by his own hands. And as the first light of dawn began to break through the mist, Gideon Hartman walked away from Gray Harbor, leaving behind the ruins of his life and the bodies of the two people who had betrayed him. But the story didn't end there. As Gideon made his way back to the cabin, his thoughts turned to the aftermath of his actions. He had killed two people, and it was only a matter of time before someone found out. The people of Gray Harbor weren't fools. They would notice when Elise and Victor didn't show up in town, and they would come looking for them. Gideon knew he couldn't stay in Gray Harbor. He couldn't face the questions, the accusations. The town that had once been his home was now a place of danger, of suspicion. He had to leave, to disappear before anyone could connect him to the murders. He reached the cabin just as the first rays of sunlight began to pierce through the fog. Inside, the fire had died down to embers, casting a dim, flickering light across the room. Victor's body lay where Gideon had left it, cold and lifeless on the floor. Gideon moved quickly, methodically. He wrapped Victor's body in a heavy blanket, securing it with the same rope he had used to strangle him. The weight of the body was heavy, but Gideon's adrenaline-fueled strength carried him through as he dragged it out to the car. He knew of a place, a spot along the coast where the cliffs were high and the current strong. It was a place where the sea claimed everything that fell into it, a place where bodies disappeared without a trace. As he drove through the fog-shrouded streets, Gideon's mind was eerily calm. He had crossed a line, done things that could never be undone, but there was no turning back now. His only option was to cover his tracks as best he could and hope that the sea would do the rest. The drive took less than 20 minutes, the road winding along the cliffs until he reached the spot he had in mind. He stopped the car, glancing around to make sure no one was watching. The fog was thick here, almost impenetrable, and the chances of being seen were slim. Still, he moved quickly, pulling Victor's body from the trunk and dragging it to the edge of the cliffs. The waves crashed below, the sound loud in the stillness of the early morning. Gideon didn't hesitate. He heaved the body over the edge, watching as it disappeared into the mist, swallowed by the ocean's depths. He waited, listening for the sound of the body hitting the water, but there was nothing, only the constant roar of the waves. Satisfied that Victor was gone, Gideon turned back to the car and drove away, leaving no trace of what he had done. As he drove back toward town, Gideon's thoughts turned to Elise. He knew the ocean would claim her as well, her body dashed against the rocks before being pulled out to sea. By the time anyone realized she was missing, there would be no evidence left, no way to prove what had happened. But despite his best efforts, the weight of his actions began to press down on him as he neared Gray Harbor. The numbness that had carried him through the night was starting to wear off, replaced by a growing sense of dread. He had killed two people he had once cared about, and now he had to live with that knowledge. He pulled into the driveway of the house he had shared with Elise, the place that had once been his sanctuary. But now, it felt like a prison, the walls closing in around him as the reality of what he had done set in. Gideon sat in the car for a long time, his hands gripping the steering wheel as he tried to steady his breathing. The house was silent, dark, the shadows stretching long in the early morning light. He knew he couldn't stay here, couldn't live in the place where his memories of Elise would haunt him. But where could he go? The thought of leaving Gray Harbor filled him with a sense of loss, of grief for the life he had destroyed. But he knew he had no choice. He had to disappear, to start over somewhere new, far away from the town that had been his home. Finally, he forced himself to move, to get out of the car and enter the house. Inside, everything was as they had left it, the furniture in place, the pictures on the walls, the remnants of a life that no longer existed. Gideon walked through the house, his footsteps echoing in the silence. He paused in the living room, his eyes drifting to the mantel where the family photos were displayed. There was a picture of him and Elise on their wedding day, their smiles wide and full of hope for the future. Next to it, a photo of the two of them at a summer barbecue, their arms around each other, laughing as the sun set behind them. The sight of those photos twisted something deep inside him, a knot of pain and regret that he couldn't untangle. He reached out, his fingers brushing against the glass of the frame, but he couldn't bring himself to pick it up. Instead, he turned away, his jaw clenched as he moved toward the bedroom. He had to pack, to gather the few things he would need to leave Gray Harbor for good. The thought of leaving everything behind, his home, his life, his memories, was almost unbearable, but he knew it was the only way. He packed quickly, throwing clothes into a suitcase without much thought. There was no time for sentimentality, no time to dwell on what he was leaving behind. He grabbed a few personal items, a watch his father had given him, a pocket knife he had carried since he was a teenager, and stuffed them into the bag. As he was about to leave the room, his eyes fell on something on Elise's bedside table. It was a small, ornate box, one that he recognized immediately. It was where Elise kept her most treasured possessions, letters, photos, little mementos from their life together. Gideon hesitated, his hand hovering over the box. Part of him wanted to open it, to see what was inside, to see if there was anything that might explain why she had betrayed him. But another part of him knew that whatever was in that box would only bring more pain. Finally, he reached out and grabbed the box, tucking it into his suitcase without opening it. He would take it with him, but he wasn't ready to confront its contents, not yet. With one last look around the room, Gideon closed the suitcase and left the house. The morning was brightening, the fog beginning to lift as he loaded the suitcase into the trunk of his car. He had no clear destination in mind, only a need to get away, to put as much distance between himself and Gray Harbor as possible. As he drove away from the town, the sun finally broke through the clouds, casting a golden light over the cliffs and the sea. Gideon didn't look back. He kept his eyes on the road ahead, his mind focused on the future, on the life he would have to build from the ashes of the one he had destroyed. But no matter how far he went, he knew he could never truly escape what he had done. The weight of his actions would follow him wherever he went, a constant reminder of the man he had become. And so Gideon Hartman drove on, leaving behind the only life he had ever known, a man alone with his guilt and his memories, heading toward an uncertain future. The road stretched out before him, disappearing into the horizon, as the town of Gray Harbor faded into the distance behind him. If you leave a comment, tell us what you think about the story you heard. It's important to us and will help us find and tell stories that you find interesting. Thank you for watching us.